Ron. It's a real pleasure to be here today. On behalf of the Committee 100, I also wanted to thank the Chinese Culture Center at San Diego State University and the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and of course, APAPA San Diego. And I'm honored to be joined by the upcoming distinguished panelists in Shu, Phil, and Howard. I just wanted to give them a shout out ahead of time. And I also wanted to thank the work of Yudan, Elizabeth, Muting, and my colleague Felicia for running the back end of our event today. Next slide, please. We at C100 are very, very grateful for the lovely memorial for our late founder, Shirley Young, that we heard just now. Big thank you to those who organized it, as well as Mr. Zhang Haochen for playing such a lovely piece. The Committee 100 is a nonpartisan American membership organization of Chinese American leaders across business, tech, government, law, the arts, and other fields. Our dual mission is to foster constructive dialogue and relations between the US and China, as well as to advocate on behalf of Chinese Americans for greater inclusion in American life and society. Thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to our presentation of From Foundations to Frontiers, Chinese American Contributions to the Fabric of America today. This presentation is part of our overall effort, as Ron highlighted, at developing and highlighting this narrative of Chinese Americans focused on our contributions to the US. Next slide, please. So our presentation today will cover what motivated C100 to commission this study, some important data and narratives that may not be as apparent in the general understanding of Chinese Americans, key takeaways, and calls to action / ways we can all come together to make a difference for not just Chinese Americans, but the overall Asian American Pacific Islander community. Next slide, please. So before we begin, I also wanted to remind everybody of our microsite that houses the white paper and 7 pillar reports covering industries like arts and culture, civil rights, entrepreneurship and business leadership, and so on. Please feel free to access it via the link on the slide. I'll pop it into the chat at the end of my presentation. Next slide, please. So C100 commissioned the Economist Intelligence Unit, the research and consulting arm of the Economist publication, to conduct the research on Chinese Americans and produce the ultimate white paper, pillar reports, and microsite. So why did we commission this research on Chinese Americans? The US, as you know, has always benefited greatly from being a multi-pluralistic, diverse, and inclusive society by taking in new ideas, values, and mindsets from around the world. If we think of all the innovation from immigrants, cultural offerings, and cuisines that have enriched American life and society, immigration and diversity are clear no-brainers. After all, race is a central issue in the US, accelerating the need for the community to know its own history and its past and current role in race relations. However, in the past few years, and especially last year in 2020, and now this year, we've witnessed a skyrocketing in anti-Chinese sentiment that quickly expanded to overall anti-Asian sentiment that clearly most likely will not disappear anytime soon. From March of last year to date, our colleagues at Stop AAPI Hate have received just under 4,000 reported incidents of racism and discrimination targeting Asian Americans across the US. And those are just the reported ones. So there's probably a lot more that we haven't captured there. And then over the past few months, well-documented vicious assaults against Asian American women, elderly, veterans, and others have made national headlines and finally focused the spotlight on virulent anti-Asian racism. As such, we saw and still see a real need for Americans to hear a more truthful, more positive narrative of Chinese Americans grounded in facts and data. Our vision is for this piece of literature to not only be a helpful centerpiece in educating Chinese Americans and Chinese in America, but also to aid the American public's understanding of Chinese Americans as fundamentally American. We also hope that the media, policymakers at all levels of government, think tanks, and business leaders can draw on our study to use in their discussions about US and China and or Chinese in America or Chinese Americans. And I also wanted to make sure that people know that this is our first go at this project. We see this as a real long-term initiative that we hope We'll include more voices that we haven't included already in this first go at the report. We know there are clear areas that we haven't touched, as well as voices in our community, including gender and sexual orientation and others that we really haven't reflected here. But I want to make sure that people know that we will continually add to this and bring in more partners over time. And finally, why does this talk and research on Chinese Americans matter for Asian American audiences? We really feel like it's important that in order for us to be good allies and friends of other Asian Americans, we need to have disaggregation of the data on Asian Americans and our experiences. Our own histories are important, and there are quite a few differences between Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, Korean Americans, you name it. And it's important for us to understand those differences and thereby come together and be able to identify what our strengths are together and what our shared interests are together. Only then will we actually be able to do the hard work of multi-ethnic coalition building within the API community, and thereby have a stronger voice going out there to other groups in the multiracial coalition and to the overall American society. Next slide, please. So what does our community look like? We are 5.3 million strong, composed of 3.9 million US citizens and 1.3 million non-citizens, encompassing permanent residents and visa holders. And this is a group nowhere close to being monolithic, but filled with immense diversity. Although our community is more highly educated on average than the national average, with 58% of Chinese Americans holding a bachelor's degree or higher, 20% of Chinese Americans still do not speak proficient English. And although Chinese Americans overall have an income level above the national average, 1 in 10 households still earns less than $15,000 each year, and 35% have incomes below the national median of $68,000. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans are also diverse in our ethnic backgrounds and origins. About 80% of Chinese Americans identify as solely Chinese, with the remaining 20% representing multi-ethnic or multiracial backgrounds. Members of our community not only hail from the regions of mainland China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, but also Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and as you heard, Burma, Myanmar, even Latin America, representing some of the different ways of immigration and routes Chinese immigrants took in coming to the US. Chinese Americans are also spread throughout the United States. New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Hawaii, and the DC area represent some of the largest and most well-known hubs of Chinese Americans. But as evidenced by the chart here, we're a growing presence really in some places that may seem unexpected, including Texas, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Washington State, and Florida. We've seen, in our research that a lot of the growth is tied to, the establishment of real academic exchange between, different universities in China and other regions in Asia and US universities. And so that's a real driving force that we've noticed. Next slide, please. No presentation on Chinese American history or of Chinese American contributions would be complete without a discussion of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a particularly dark moment in American history whose impact is still felt today. From the 1850s through the late 1870s, Chinese immigrants came to the West Coast seeking better economic opportunities than they had in Qing Dynasty China as a means of earning income to send back to their relatives. Due to their lack of legal protection and pressure to earn income to send home to support their families there, Chinese laborers often took low-wage work, well below the wages that were paid to white laborers, which ended up creating more competition for jobs. This led to deep resentment from white laborers displaced from work and those now facing more competition for work. Domestic resentment from white labor interests then led to legislative action at the state level, specifically restricting the rights of Chinese in America, as well as immigration pathways to the US. At the same time, extrajudicial acts of violence were often committed against Chinese in America without strong mechanisms of enforcement to deter such crime or to prosecute them, and of course, the lack of political will. And we don't have time to jump into those real painful moments of Chinese American suffering. But I really recommend that people spend the time to dive into those later on. Driven by anti-Chinese sentiment and opportunistic politicians, the US Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which stayed in effect for 6 decades until 1943. The act barred the entry of Chinese workers and prohibited Chinese people from becoming citizens through naturalization. As a result, Chinese Americans were restricted to the margins of society, facing limited employment opportunities and possessing no political power. This piece of legislation contributed to the reversal of the trend of increasing Chinese immigration that we can see here on the chart. There's a real noticeable dip, and it lasted for a long time. Next slide, please. Zooming back out to look at the overall history of Chinese ethnic immigration to the US, spanning at least 175 years, we see a tapestry of difficult periods and challenges to Chinese Americans in establishing themselves as truly American. In addition to the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were other restrictive policies that targeted Chinese. It certainly was not the last. One example is the California Alien Land Law of 1913 that prevented ownership or long-term leasing of land. Of course, this is against the backdrop of several other racist policies targeting Black Americans like Jim Crow laws and Plessy v. Ferguson, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Eastern European Americans. They all faced different forms of legislated discrimination at this time. I also wanted to highlight the Page Act of 1875, which specifically barred not only Chinese women, but also other Asian women in this country, casting Asian women as sex workers and prostitutes who were morally bankrupt. This hypersexualization of Asian women, something made abundantly bare to the American public for the first time for many others, like Asian American women who've had to deal with this for a long time. This has always been very clear to them. It's made abundantly clear amid the Atlanta killings of the last week. It has a direct root in this historical moment in America and this piece of legislation. We don't, of course, have much time to go into this further, but I also highly recommend the audience consider taking a look at this on their own. This law aimed to prevent Chinese and, by extension, Asians from reproducing here and forming families on American soil. So a very pernicious policy that has had lasting effects. And then finally, in 1943, the US Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, but still kept restrictions against Chinese in America in place for the most part. It wasn't until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, over 20 years later, that these restrictions were truly lifted and Chinese immigrants could come to America and stay on more equal footing with other immigrant groups. Next slide, please. So now that we have an overview of Chinese immigration to the US, a very bare bones one, let me give you a brief overview of how we're presenting our community's contributions. We'll cover the contributions in the following 3 buckets: building an economic powerhouse, strengthening national institutions, which covers things like justice, politics, and public service, as well as civil rights, and then enriching the social and cultural fabric. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans today are present in a wide variety of industries and occupations. We're making contributions as chefs, taxi drivers, bankers, lawyers, scientists, teachers, accountants, among many other occupations. In the US workforce, there are 2.3 million Chinese Americans. Today, Chinese Americans contribute $304 billion in consumer spending, which supports 3 million jobs in this country, many of which, of course, support non-Chinese Americans. Entrepreneurship has also been one of the key avenues by which Chinese Americans have not only carved livelihoods out for themselves, but also made a remarkable impact. Chinese restaurants are one prime example of this. 1 in 10 businesses that provide food and accommodation services is Chinese American owned. Another amazing data point that we discovered is that there are 45,000 Chinese restaurants, far eclipsing the number of McDonald's, Pizza Huts, Taco Bells, and Wendy's combined. This was like incredibly surprising to me. Of course, we did these numbers before the coronavirus crisis, and so considerable number of these establishments probably went under, sadly. But this is, arguably America's cuisine if there are so many Chinese restaurants. Panda Express, of course, one of America's well-known fast food chains, is a Chinese-owned restaurant as well as a Chinese cuisine-based restaurant. In the corporate world and white-collar industries, however, despite Chinese Americans' overrepresentation in the entry-level and mid-level ranks, Chinese Americans are still vastly underrepresented in senior-level executive positions. Chinese Americans face a bamboo ceiling where white professionals are 3 times as likely to reach executive ranks. This is one area where we, as a community, can definitely advocate for changes. Next slide, please. Likewise, Chinese Americans have made significant contributions in infrastructure. In the late 1800s, Chinese made up 90% of the labor force that built the western half of the Central Pacific Railroad and worked on other rail projects that linked the US. The completion of these railroads connected the country, enabling even greater economic growth and connectivity. Within 10 years of completion, the Transcontinental Railroad transported $1.3 billion in today's dollars worth of freight annually. The impact of their contribution is still felt today, as the freight rail industry still transports nearly 40% of goods and products each year and supports 1.5 million American jobs. Additionally, another cool data point that I really enjoy is if you like wine, you may especially appreciate this data point. California is home to one of the most prolific and well-regarded wine industries in the world, producing 90% of all US wine today. Now, in the late 19th century, Chinese immigrants helped to establish the foundation of said wine industry in Napa and Sonoma by constructing roads, stone bridges, rock walls, wine cellars, and irrigation ditches. They also worked in vineyards in Southern California. Between 1856 and 1869, Chinese workers planted the majority of Sonoma County's 3.2 million grapevines. It's estimated that the entire wine industry in California would have been set back 30 to 50 years without the contribution of Chinese vineyard workers. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans have been important drivers of US scientific advancement and innovation, creating jobs and capital market growth. We're well represented in STEM-related occupations across computer science, biotech, engineering, architecture, and other fields. From 1995 to 1998, 1 in 5 high-tech startups in Silicon Valley were run by Chinese immigrants. At the end of that 3-year period, these companies generated over $13.2 billion in sales and created up to 42,000 jobs. Fast forward to 2011 to 2020, we've seen 9 Fortune 500 companies creating a combined 332,000 jobs, and their market cap together amounts to $578 billion at their historic peak. On the right side of the slide, you can see some of the logos of companies founded or co-founded by Chinese Americans. The semiconductor industry is one critically important area in which Chinese Americans, time and again, are still making major strides. In 1963, Chi Tang-sa invented complementary metal oxide semiconductor used in nearly all modern semiconductor chips, laying the foundation for the following entrepreneurs and business leaders: Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, David K. Lam of Lam Research, and Lisa Su, who is president and CEO of Advanced Micro Devices. And they also, of course, influenced a wide variety of non-Chinese American entrepreneurs. On the right, we can also see other well-known household names like Zoom, founded by Eric S. Yuan, and Steve Chen, co-founder of YouTube, Yahoo co-founder Jerry Yang, and Ken Xie, founder of Fortinet. Their success was only made possible by academic exchange between the US, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and an immigration policy that recognized the value of attracting the world's talented, ambitious minds and hearts. Many of the Chinese American entrepreneurs and business leaders came to the US to study and remained here, creating jobs and even more opportunities for others. Next slide, please. So this section covers the strengthening American institutions element. Here, we've highlighted 2 pretty important Supreme Court cases in which Chinese Americans were the real drivers of change. Due to time constraints, I'll only highlight one. United States versus Wang Kim Ark. Wang Kim Ark was born in the US to Chinese immigrant parents who were Chinese citizens. And this is back in the late 1800s, so it was Qing Dynasty Chinese citizens. Wang previously had visited China and returned to the US without any issues with re-entry. But in 1895, upon returning from another trip to China, he was detained at customs in SF for 5 months on steamships in the harbor. So he was living off of ships for 5 months, and the conditions were not great, to say the least. With legal help and support from the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, Wang challenged the decision, which ended up being heard by the US Supreme Court. In a 6-2 decision, the court definitively ruled that if a child was born in the US to Chinese citizens who are lawful permanent residents, that child is then a US citizen under the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Wang's case confirmed birthright citizenship, a case that has had an immeasurable impact on America, contributing to the wealth in ethnic, racial, and linguistic diversity in our country. Ron mentioned earlier that he's has immigrant roots in Burma. I was born in the U.S., of course, but my family is clearly not from the U.S. My parents would not be here today without this birthright citizenship clause, and my sister and I would not be here today if not for that as well. So I'm very thankful for the work that all these Chinese Americans did way early on. Next slide, please. Chinese Americans have been an increasing presence in public service. The number of Chinese Americans employed in public administration roles grew by 68% from 2009 to 2018. Chinese Americans are now punching above our weight, as seen in the table on the right, punching above our weight, if only so slightly. The numbers are still quite small, but tack well to our proportion of the population. Of course, we can still consistently improve the pipeline to government roles and to other roles in public service. And we also want to keep in mind that the numbers are small, partly because of the history of exclusion laws and lasting discrimination, implicit and legislated, that prevented Chinese Americans from accessing many aspects of life in America, including political life. Last year, in 2020, we saw Andrew Yang run for president, which was certainly a watershed and historic moment, regardless of whether we share his political beliefs. But he actually was not the first Chinese American or API to run for the office of president. US Senator from Hawaii, Hiram Fong, was the first to run for president, running for the 1964 Republican nomination. A cool tidbit that people seem to forget. And just a few days ago, Catherine Tai was officially confirmed to her new role as the next US trade representative, a cabinet level position in which she will steer US trade policy overall, including toward China. And so she's also the first woman and Asian American woman to sit in that seat. So a very, very wonderful moment for our community and a lot of responsibility going forward. Next slide, please. Another moment in Chinese American history that is integral to the Chinese American narrative is the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. Chin was a 27-year-old Chinese American from Michigan who was killed by 2 white auto workers, angered by the loss of auto manufacturing jobs to Japan. They brutally beat Chin with a baseball bat, but received a punishment of no jail time and only $3,000 in fines with 3 years worth of probation. This tragedy triggered an outpouring of collective grief in not only the Chinese American community, but also the overall API community. Chinese American youth, parents, and grandparents marched and protested around the country, demanding justice for Chin, his family, and Asian Americans everywhere. The protests of 2020, linked to the George Floyd tragedy, are actually much closer to the Chinese American experience than what may seem the case. Protests and raising our voice have consistently been part of our DNA as Americans and Chinese Americans fighting for justice. And now we're seeing another moment like this, another watershed moment for our community, for Asian Americans overall, in the tragedy of in Atlanta. And so we're still seeing how this plays out. And next slide, please. Although the stereotype of Chinese Americans as doctors, engineers, and lawyers is hard to break, we actually have data to show that Chinese Americans have been punching above our weight in arts and culture. For instance, we have individuals like Maya Lin and her Vietnam War Memorial. That is the second most attended landmark in DC, second only to the Lincoln Memorial. We have an example of Crazy Rich Asians and the all Asian cast that was involved in that. And that really skyrocketed to being the highest grossing romantic comedy of the last decade. And then we have individuals like Richard Louis, and Amara Walker and all these other really wonderful Asian American journalists who are really reporting, and we really see them now, and they're very visible, especially with the news that happened last week. So, really wonderful strides being made. And then on the left side, in the vast majority of these creative fields, Chinese American representation has been at or above its share of the overall US population. And so, fashion designers are at 5.6%, well above our 1.2% share of the overall US population. Architects are at 3.5%. And so, these numbers are promising, very promising. But at the same time, it's important to step back and think, where are these positions really being situated? Are these at the highest levels of their fields? The answer is mostly not. And that's a real problem and something that we need to really rebuild, to build a real pipeline for going forward. Next slide, please. Last but not at all least is the Chinese Americans who make enormous contributions in the arena of public health. Chinese Americans account for 7% of biological, medical, and other life scientists in the US, more than 5 times our share in the total US population. This 7% of all those scientists and doctors includes a substantial number of doctors on the front lines of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, other doctors still seeing patients in this climate, and scientists and researchers continually refining the vaccine. And these numbers also don't cover the kinds of healthcare professionals like nurses and other medical support roles that Chinese Americans are consistently playing for Americans overall. One tidbit that I like to highlight is that the N95 mask, one of the staples in our fight against COVID-19, was also invented by an American of Chinese heritage by the name of Peter Tsai. And finally, in the fight against the HIV/AIDS epidemic, several Chinese American researchers made remarkable contributions to containing the epidemic and safeguarding public health. In the mid-1990s, David Ho was one such scientist developing an HIV treatment known as combination antiretroviral therapy, which involves a combination of drugs that work together to help to treat HIV. This treatment proved to be a turning point in the epidemic. Dr. Ho's therapy transformed AIDS from being a fatal disease into a far more treatable, non-life-threatening condition. Since its implementation in 1996, combination retroviral therapy has helped to significantly reduce HIV/AIDS mortality in the US and beyond. So far, more than 25 million people worldwide have benefited from this treatment. Next slide, please. So what are some obstacles to Chinese Americans' contributions? From what we've seen, Chinese Americans, especially those who don't speak English well, and don't have high levels of education, really struggle to advance socioeconomically. We also see a large number of eligible voters in our community not going out to vote. So voter turnout is incredibly important to making our voice heard. And this is a big area of focus for our community going forward. And Chinese Americans are also incredibly underrepresented in leadership positions across a variety of fields. For instance, Chinese Americans are roughly 3% of professionals, but only hold 1.2% of executive positions in the private sector. In higher ed, where Chinese Americans really have a strong presence in teaching and research positions at 2.2% of the population, we're actually only 0.5% of all college presidents. So there's a real gap there in spite of our contributions to research, to teaching, and to educating America's future leaders. And then finally, anti-Chinese sentiment, the real elephant in the room, linked to the COVID pandemic, but also having been around for a very, very long time. It's something that our community really needs to have a strong voice against, and we need to demand that the overall American community is also with us there. We need to challenge this perception of Chinese Americans as perpetually foreign. Next slide, please. Key takeaways, Chinese Americans, we've always made extensive contributions to the US in spite of some incredibly horrible discriminatory barriers, with the Exclusion Act, Page Act, all these other acts that were really, developed to prevent us from, having any sort of stake in this country. We've been here, all those folks who came, they stayed, and then more people decided to come, and there are more people who want to come. And so it's incredibly important that we, can show that Chinese Americans are committed to this country. Second, Chinese Americans have been able to contribute in ways that have changed over time as America has become more welcoming to, Chinese Americans as well as immigrants overall and immigration. Chinese Americans have been able to really show our true colors and show our true colors in contributing in new ways a lot more. And third, there's enormous economic and creative potential that Chinese Americans have yet to tap into. And that's exactly why we need to dismantle all these persistent stereotypes and exclusionary attitudes, and of course, anti-Asian racism that ultimately prevents us from really being confident in who we are as Americans for America. Next slide, please. So we've developed a few calls to action, and I'll only go through some of them. I'll go through the first three, just because these are the ones that C100 we're very much devoting our resources to focusing on at this moment. The first is educate American society about the immense history of contribution and struggle by Asian Americans through policy advocacy for Asian American studies curricula. And so we're very heartened to see that an ethnic studies curriculum covering public high schools in California, despite some concerns of things that it's covered, it's overall a really great step, because now we have this. Now we're actually saying we're going to educate kids and our future leaders on the experiences of not just Asian Americans, but all these other ethnic and racial groups who've been ignored historically in our teaching of US history. In Illinois, I think there is a piece of legislation saying that we need to have Asian American studies for public schools there that just went advanced through committee. So that's a very positive sign. And so we really see this as a great step for us to get on board with. Second, demand that the US government respect and protect Chinese American scientists and academics from unfair racial profiling. And I also wanted to add, we also think it's important that America is committed to academic exchange so that more talent can come to this country and benefit us all. We have an effort that my colleague Felicia is leading on capturing data related to how this kind of negative pressure and really intense scrutiny, unwarranted scrutiny against Chinese researchers is impacting American academia overall. And then third, we want to break down the bamboo ceiling and advocate tangible policy toward greater representation of leadership roles for API across all industries and fields. It's incredibly important that our communities, really hardworking, devoted individuals across different industries are rewarded for that hard work and are seen. And we need to have more Chinese American and Asian American figures at the highest levels. Next slide, please. And of course, we have a specific call to action on combating anti-Asian hate that we released prior to the horrible tragedies of the last week. We have a 7-point plan to combat increasing violence targeting Asian Americans, and you can find this press release on our website. I'm not going to go through it because there are a lot of steps, but it's really about marshaling the voice of Chinese Americans and Asian Americans overall to really demand change that should have happened years ago, to demand policy changes and a real change in attitudes toward who we are, and to treat us as equals and Americans instead of people who should be seen as spies and untrustworthy. So you can take a look at this on our website. The slide is still up here, but next slide, please. Of course, I wanted to plug the microsite again and plug the kind of research that we've developed, the whole impetus behind this effort. Definitely check this out. I'll put it in the chat. Next slide, please. And if you want to get involved with C100 and some of these calls to action, we're very excited to work with the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, SDSU's Chinese Culture Center, as well as APAPA, and any other groups that you're a part of, even if they're informal assemblages of people. We are excited to hear from you, and we really see a strong commitment to building these grassroots ties that we may not have done historically, but that 2020 and 2021 have shown us that this is our focus going forward. So thank you everybody so much. I'm going to turn it back to Ron, who will direct traffic to our next panelists.
Thank you, Lloyd. Really enlightening study. I think society knows anecdotally the economic contributions of Chinese Americans, from the workforce contributions to small business owner, entrepreneurship, consumers, and education. But what the study really brings to the forefront is the scientific data to affirm the general understanding and its narratives and its struggles, and it is the studies to be commended. At this point, if the distinguished panelists wouldn't mind to turn on your video, Dr. Chang, Dr. Chen, Dr. Chin, and Dr. Wang, please. I want to make sure you guys are.
Excuse me, I can't turn on my video.
No, no, I was gonna, Dr. Chang, Dr. Chien, Dr. Chin, and Dr. Wang only right now. Okay, so let's proceed with, I would like to introduce Dr. Lilly Cheng. Dr. Cheng is the director of Chinese Cultural Center at San Diego State University. She served as professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences and executive director of Chinese Studies Institute at SDSU. She served as the chair of the International Affairs Board of the City of San Diego for 10 years and the chair of the Asian Pacific Historical Thematic District for the City of San Diego. She also served as the state of California as its chair of the Board of Examiners for Speech Pathology and Audiology and a member of the California Health Foundation. Dr. Chang is the chair of the Asian Pacific Islander American Public Affairs, the San Diego Chapter. In 2020, she returned to the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, is now serving as the chair of the board of directors. Dr. Chang was selected by ABC News as one of 25 most influential women in the history of San Diego. Dr. Chang has published numerous articles and books on cross-cultural communication research, translation and interpretation, language learning disorders, and language teaching focus on development of an optimal language learning environment. Dr. Shu Chien. Dr. Chien received pre-medical education at Peking University and his medical degree from National Taiwan University. After receiving his PhD in physiology from Columbia University, he served as a faculty in the department until 1988. In 1988, he was recruited to University of San Diego, where he is a university professor of bioengineering and medicine. In 1994, he established the Department of Bioengineering and served as the founding chair. In 2008, he was appointed the founding director of the Institute of Engineering and Medicine to foster the application of engineering principles and technologies to improve healthcare delivery. He retired from UCSD in November of 2019. Dr. Chien has published 600 original publications in international scientific journals and edited 16 books. Dr. Chien has received 6 honorary doctoral degrees, 16 honorary professorship, the Novell Medical twice, Revell Medical Medal, Franklin Medal, and the Founders Award of National Academy of Engineering. He is an honorary member of the Chinese Association of Physiological Science in Beijing and Chinese Physiology Society Taipei. As directors of NIH training grants at Columbia and UCSD, he has been responsible for training hundreds of predoctoral and postdoctoral trainees. Dr. Phil Chen. Dr. Chen is a professor emeritus in the Division of Special Education and Counseling at Cal State University, Los Angeles, where he taught multicultural education, special education, and served as a special education division chair. He served for 6 years directing the Office of Multicultural and Ethnic Concerns at the Council for Exceptional Children. He was department head at Texas A&M University, Commerce, and a division chair at California State University, LA. He is the co-author of 3 textbooks. The 11th edition of Multicultural Education in a Pluralistic Society, Pearson, was released in 2021. He has co-authored 2 special education texts. He also served on the California State Advisory Commission for Special Education. Dr. Howard Wang. Dr. Wang has over 30 years of work experience in higher education and served for the last 12 years as an associate VP for student affairs. He retired in 2018 from Duke Kushan University in China after having served as the associate dean of students and adjunct professors in education, and from Beijing Normal University as the adjunct professor in higher education. Dr. Wen edited and wrote a book on APIs in education and articles related to global university student affairs. He has always been an advocate for social justice and education equity for members of the API communities. He currently serves on the board of associates with the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, Los Angeles Lodge, and a member of the board of directors with the Chinese Historical Society of Southern California. He is a member of OCA Los Angeles Chapter and interim VP for Orange County Chapter. Dr. Wang is the chair of APAPA San Gabriel Valley. And last but not least, Dr. Wang has been appointed to serve as a member of the Board of Trustees of the University of the West. Welcome, distinguished panelists. Again, it is my honor to help in this engaging conversation. The C100 report highlights the successes of Chinese Americans as a subgroup of Asian Americans and its past struggles. As far-reaching as the report demonstrates, it also could reinforce the stereotyping of strength of Chinese Americans community and fortifying the model minority myth. And we don't really need to go into what is the definition of a model minority myth, but the narrative could create a false sense that completely negates the economic and social disparity. Even worse, it is a narrative that could be used to harm and prevent resources to help. So panelists, again, the contributions by Chinese American society should be recognized and celebrated. How should we move forward with positive data and work on the key takeaways, as Lloyd mentioned in his presentation? Commitment to the nation, more welcoming society, removing stereotyping, and which is the model minority myth. Dr. Chang, would you please comment on that?
What I like to do, Ron, is to ask our distinguished panelists, Dr. Chen, and then Dr. Chin and Dr. Wang to respond first. And I will add my humble comments later. Dr. Shu Chien, would you please? Please unmute. Unmute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lilly. First I want to thank Lloyd Fang for giving this outstanding speech. This is really very inspiring and stimulating. I would also like to thank Ron Cho and Committee of 100, 100, and APAPA for making this possible, together with the San Diego Chinese Historical Museum, and Dr. Lilly Cheng for putting all this together. I think in this stimulating speech, Lloyd has given us a tremendously informative summary of the Chinese community in America. First, we're a fast-growing, diverse community, and we have grown from the early days as a contributor to the building of the economic powerhouse, such as building of the railroad, to the today, when we're pushing innovating frontiers and making public health breakthroughs, shaping public policy and politics, as well as enriching American culture. However, we still face many difficult situations. We must overcome these obstacles so that we can make even better contributions to be an equal member of the American societies with all the other ethnic groups. So we have, on the one hand, we have to continue to excel in the areas we're doing well, but on the other hand, we have to move into other areas and make better breakthroughs, particularly in the public service in politics. We have to participate more actively so that we can be fully represented in the both the government and the public sectors of the United States, be a very effective member of the communities so that the Chinese Americans are fully represented and recognized as equal as every other person in the United States. The recent unfortunate incidents such as what happened in Atlanta and other places are really very disheartening. So we need to also educate our fellow citizens in the United States about the importance of the contributions made by the Chinese Americans and the importance of treating every citizen as equal in the true spirit of the United States of America. So these are the things we have to work on, and we need to be brave and positive and assertive, and not to back away from our deserved positions and responsibilities and privileges. So these are the things we need to work on. And today's lecture really helped us to focus on these and do better in the days to come. So this is my initial comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chien. Dr. Chien, would you like to comment?
You're speaking about this, Dr. Chien, Phil Chen?
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes.
I'd like to share a little bit about my personal background, so and clarify a little bit. I was born and raised in Hawaii, and my last name is Chinese, and I'm primarily Chinese. I'm also a mixed race. My maternal grandmother was part Hawaiian and part English and part Spanish, as well as being Chinese. And she married a Chinese man from China. And so my parents were all born in Hawaii, and I'm culturally Hawaiian in many respects. In the area of my work, I have not been working specifically with Asian Americans. My area of work has been in special education and more specifically in recent years in multicultural education. So I have been promoting education for all the different various ethnic groups as well, African Americans and Hispanic Americans or Latinx. So I wanted to clarify that in terms of my background. When I was growing up in Hawaii, I remember in grade school, one of my teachers putting on a record for us of the great soprano Marian Anderson. Some of you know who Marian Anderson was. She was a Black American who had achieved tremendous fame throughout Europe. And even in the United States, when they were trying to find a venue for her to sing in Washington, D.C., and Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental in this. She was denied the opportunity to sing in the largest venue there, which was owned by the Daughters of American Revolution, and because she was Black. And so it ended up that she was singing, that she did a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Monument. And I remember as a child being told this story, and I had no idea, living in Hawaii, even where Washington, D.C., let alone what the Lincoln Memorial was. But I did know the story, which stayed in my heart all my life, about how she had met a tremendous amount of prejudice, but overcame this with her greatness and her great class that she had. Anyway, this story stayed with me all my life, and I've always admired her. So when I was able to buy recordings of her, I did this as an adult. Now, a number of years ago, I was invited by one of my outstanding multicultural colleagues, Jim Banks at University of Washington, in a conference there to make a presentation. And one of the things that we did there was he took us to the Chinese American Museum in Seattle. And one of the things that I was so impressed with is they had suitcases, large suitcases packed with materials and instructional materials that could be sent out to the schools on request at no cost. And all the instructions for teachers, regardless of their ethnic background, that they could provide instruction to young children about Chinese Americans. And I think this is one of the keys that we need to start with the children. And if we can get into the schools and as a teacher did for me in Hawaii, to help me understand Black Americans and the discrimination that they met, and making me so conscious of discrimination and racism, even as a child, that we can start doing this with our children today. This is one of the things. I'm a teacher educator by background, and this is one of the things that I would advocate.
Thank you, Dr. Phil Chen. Dr. Wang?
Hi. I'd like to thank, first of all, Lloyd for his presentation. Reading the report is very onerous because this volume was pages and pages, and he did an excellent job summarizing it. When I first read the report, I had the same feeling as Ron did, is that we are playing into the hands of proponents of the model minority myth and also perpetual foreigner syndrome. But I'm so glad that verbally Lloyd added a few more pieces of information that's not quite in the report, but is something that he mentioned that he wants to do in the future. I think that get into my answer to where do we go from here, is that there seems to be a lack of information or on the history of Chinese Americans, even though in the report as well as in the verbal presentation by Lloyd mentioned about the railroad workers, but the trials and tribulations of those workers needs to be talked about and discussed in K through 12 ethnic studies curriculum, which is a current effort in California and legislatively speaking, to include that as a graduation requirement for high school. So that way we can accomplish two things. One is to learn about the Asian American and Chinese American history. The other one, we can learn about history of other ethnic groups. That will get at my second action to come, is that to work as partners with other groups, ethnic groups, people of color, so that we both have a good understanding of their history and our history, so that we understand that our accomplishments and their accomplishments did not come by accident. Okay, our ancestors went through trials and tribulations to get us here. So what the first report, like Lloyd said, this is a work in progress. It did not go too much deeply into the history of Chinese Americans. I mean, someone on Facebook, on the email that I read, that asked the question, is this the first incident that killed so many Asian American women in Atlanta? He said that he dug up the history, didn't find any similar tragedy. But I mentioned that, because I just recently been educated, I have to say that the Los Angeles Chinatown massacre, about 500 or 600 mobs, white person, go into the old Chinatown, Los Angeles, and kill about 15 to 20 Chinese. That's a large scale. That's more than just 6 or 7 Asian American women, which is a separate issue. Not only they're Asian American, but they're also women. So to be educated to that, you can put things in perspective and be able to carry on a conversation with someone who might say, "Oh, you guys got it made. Now look at the excellent actors and artists and so many well-known people and so on." Well, yes, that's true, but we work hard for that. Our ancestors work hard for that, to overcome discrimination, to overcome racism. So education is one of it, and our own educational history is also part of it. So those are the things that we need to do to in future reports, or to educate Chinese Americans and Asian Americans about our own history. So.
Thank you, Dr. Wang. Dr. Chang.
Yeah, it is Chen, Chin. That's why we have a little difficulty.
Yes.
That's the beauty of the Chinese language. I want to thank Committee 100, Lloyd, for your significant contribution to this major presentation. And of course, I admire Dr. Shu Chien, I admire Phil Chen, and of course, Howard Wang. I think you have hit the nail on the head. I wanted to say to Lloyd especially, that in 1974, there was a US Supreme Court case, Lau versus Nichols. This particular case was unanimously approved by the US Supreme Court to allow those who could not speak English, not just Chinese, but anybody, to have a fair chance at education by using the mother tongue as a way to augment our education. It's so important that when we look at education, what do we mean by equal opportunities? So this is a case that should be also mentioned, at least in some of our, at least in some of our discussions. The Chinese, especially the Chinese, have been stereotyped as the model minority, the silent minority, but more importantly, the invisible minority. We need to be more visible. We need to be out there, to be seen, to be heard, to be included, not to be excluded. The Chinese Exclusion Act gave us a big lesson. We do not want such a lesson to come back again. So how do we become more included? What opportunities are there to encourage our involvement? How can we empower the so-called silent minority and the marginalized minority? We must work together. I want to hear from Lloyd and all of you how we can be better engaged and how we can better educate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Lloyd, is there a piece that you want to pick off to kind of discuss?
Oh yeah, I mean, I can just go from there. I just want to thank all of these distinguished panelists who've long, very storied careers, and I'm just beginning on mine, so I have a lot that I admire in all of you, and a lot of lessons and wisdom to draw on, even just from the last few minutes of listening to each of you. So thank you all so much. To your question, Lilly, of next steps and what we can do to make our voice heard. This is something that the Committee 100 is very much thinking about how it can do on behalf of our community, because this organization is, it's an assemblage of people who are very successful, and it has, it's easy to interpret them as the small minority and to really lean into that. And so we're very cognizant of not doing that. And part of what we really see as an important next step, right, is to make sure that we know our community. And I think, even an org like C100, right, that needs to know its community more and understand the diversity of in age, in socioeconomic experience, in linguistic diversity, in ideological diversity, right? This is something that it's not just the responsibility of an org like C100, right? It's also an individual responsibility. There's, for instance, a lot of different voices that feel politically strong about different issues, and that, the same sort of polarization that we're seeing across America, right? We see very strongly, at least in the mainland Chinese immigrant community, in our community overall. There has to be something that needs to happen there. I mean, that's one area that, Lilly, I'm thinking about very personally, right? My own father, very educated man from mainland China, came over in the 80s, 90s. He and I have very different political beliefs, and we've butted heads a lot in the last years on these things. And even the 2 weeks ago, we had a very, very contentious argument about things related to Chinese Americans. But something happened this week, right? Something horrible happened to people, that could have been my dad, could have been my sister, could have been my mom, could have been a lot of people who, we care about. We see ourselves in a lot of the victims and the families who have to keep going, right? And, my dad told me this morning, right before this call, but he told my mom and my dad told me that they were going to a Stop AAPI Hate rally in New York City, in Chinatown. And these are people who told me not to go protesting for a long time. Don't get too involved in political activities, given their experience in the Cultural Revolution, right? There's a lot of pain and suffering that I got to understand better as to why my parents think a certain way. And I think there's responsibility from young people, right, who have very different beliefs and who might feel very emotional about things, to really try to be calm and to learn from our parents and our forebears, and to understand where they can come from. And so seeing that play out in my own life, I really feel like there's a lot that can be done here and that needs to be done. And, people can change their minds about things, and you can't change them, but only they can change their own minds, right? But it happens. And I'm really heartened to see this change happen in my own family. And so there's a lot of hope and optimism. I know that there's a lot of negativity and pessimism on all sides about what's happening in our country and our community, but I see like a beacon of light going forward, and I think that that's very promising. So that's my first comment to you, Lilly, and I turn it back to all these others on this panel.
Great, thank you, Lloyd. I want to follow up with that, and it's critical in a sense that the pandemic has not only has not created but revealed and widened so many fault lines in our social fabric, and we're woke, we're awakened, if you will, and through your comments and your experience this morning with your parents. But it's deep rooted. It's deep rooted. Assimilation through education and collaboration is important. Again, here's the myth: Asian American tends to isolate themselves. We only care about our children's education and the success in the workplace. That's the myth. And in your study in 2045, the racial minorities collectively will be the majority. That's not too far away. That's not too far away. Dr. Philip Chen, your textbook that you co-author, the 11th Pluralistic Society of Multicultural Education and the integration of ethnic studies as a curriculum requirement in high school are great steps. How do we collectively understand the differences in ethnic and racial diversity? And Lloyd, you mentioned the multi-racial coalition. From my perspective, and I want to tie this up with this panelist, is the fact that how do we collectively grow the pie of opportunities? The hope should be that it should mutually benefit us collectively in growing the pie across racial ethnicity, racial groups, and to help mitigate the disparities. Because without us collectively working together, the disparity and the divide and the tension will remain unless we solve that collectively. So I present that to this panelist and have their thoughts on this. And I'm just going to start. Dr. Wang.
I have a premonition that you're going to call on me first. Well, the pie is limited. So if everyone start thinking about, I'm going to have a thin slice, the next person's, well, that's a little too big. I want you to get a little thinner. So once we get into the quantitative evaluation of the situation of the limited pool, so to speak, limited opportunities, whatever you're going to call it, then we're not going to get anywhere. So it calls for sacrifice, not intentionally, but based on your own nature, your own personality. I was watching and having a general discussion for a film that was produced by Bowen Chu and Larissa Lam. They took Bowen took his father, who have never met his father, meaning Bowen's grandfather, to Mississippi. And Mississippi is you can imagine what the small town that is. There's a grocery store that his grandfather operated. And in the African American, they call it black sector, because the white people don't want the Chinese American to open groceries there. They don't cater them. They don't want them to do business. So Chinese move into the black area. So they open grocery store. And then African American residents will go into the grocery store to buy grocery because they can't go to the white grocery store to do it. So Chinese, his grandfather served them very well. If they cannot pay it, you put it on tap. And then whenever you can afford to pay it. Now that's at a disadvantage of the owner. If you're at a grocery store and too profit-minded, then you're not going to survive too long. So, but they were generous. So the effect is that they mutually benefit each other. And guess what? That reverberated in the future actions. Now, his father, Baldwin's father, and Baldwin and his wife and kid went to visit. And guess what? All the African-American older generation came out. They said, oh yeah, I know your grandfather. I know, talking to Baldwin's father, I know your dad. He's so generous and so on. So there's a lot of camaraderie. That's a good example of what we should be doing with so-called the other ethnic groups. Forget about counting, how we can divide the pie. You should think about how I can help you. And then if I need it, how you can help me. That's it.
Great, thank you. Dr. Phil Chen, again, I wish I read your textbook and it is a start of something from a geographical and culture, the regional diversity, all that aspect of what Dr. Wang stated. Can you carry on with what the comment on growing the pie and the diversity?
No, I feel very strongly that with there's strength in numbers, and I'm talking about everybody joining together. In my work at the Council for Exceptional Children, running the Office of Multicultural and Ethnic Concerns, I started and had held the very first Exceptional Black Child Conference in the country. And then later, the very first bilingual Exceptional Child Conference. And so with that, I had to work, I didn't have to, but I worked closely with a lot of my African-American colleagues and a lot of my Hispanic colleagues. And they have always appreciated my support in that work. The other night, I had a call from the executive director of the National Association for Multicultural Education. I had served as their vice president and also the editor of their official journal at one time. And she's African-American and very concerned and very upset over the crisis in Atlanta, and wanted to put out a statement for the organization in terms of condemning the violence and this type of behavior, and wanted me to look it over. So I did, and at the same time, we started talking about some of the things we could do, and they're coming to Anaheim in November and having their annual conference there. And I suggested that we have a panel to deal with some of this aggressive behaviors that we're experiencing. But what I suggested is that we not, although what she was concerned with was the attacks on Asians, but that we do it in terms of including all the other groups, because there's been attacks on Muslims, on the Jews, if you remember, in the Tree of Life synagogue where the Jewish individuals were massacred, and attacks on LGBTQ individuals. So I suggested that we put the panel together. We could start it with the idea of the recent attacks on the Asians, but we're all together in this. We're all being attacked. And if we work at it together, there's so much more strength in the numbers. And this is what I'm seeing. I'm seeing my Black colleagues, my Hispanic colleagues emailing me with their concern. And I think this is a time we can capitalize on this and all work together. And I think it can be so much more effective than us going and doing this alone in terms of our concern about attacks against the Chinese.
Thank you. Dr. Chien, you're on mute. Please unmute yourself.
I agree with what has been said. We're building the coalition to convert our minorities into a majority eventually is very critical. In collaboration, in my personal collaborations in scientific work, I have a principle of 40-60. That is, out of 100% work, I'll do 60%, and I will take only 40% of the credit. I will not apply that to communities, ethnic groups, but I would say 51-49. We would be willing to do a little more work than the other groups, but would be willing to take a little less of the credit. In this way, we can get everybody together. 50-50 is very hard to define. So if we're willing to have this give and take, you can build up the big coalition, which is good for everybody. There's this concept of big self, small self. You need to have very strong small self to make the community work, but you need a big self to synergize all the small selves. So we got to have this coalition that, as everybody has mentioned, otherwise we cannot get enough influence, enough power. The other thing is about things like language. In order for the Chinese Americans to get ahead, we've got to be very strong in language, in the English language, because that is the language used in the United States. But on the other hand, we must not give up on our traditional language, the Chinese language. If we can learn it, particularly for the younger generation, we should encourage that. So it is, again, like a dichotomy. We have to be excellent, outstanding in the use and speaking and writing of the English language. But on the other hand, we must try to preserve and excel in our Chinese language. So this is like everything else, seems like dichotomy, but we have to do both. I think in life, we always have many demands. The question is, how do we apportion our time, apportion our priorities, so we can achieve not just one thing, but multiple things. But in summary, it's extremely important for us to be excellent in the use of the English language, both in the spoken and written ways, so that we can get ahead in the society. This is essential, not only in our own profession, but in the community life, in politics, in gaining our recognition in the government, in the legislative representation. We must work hard on our language. I'm an immigrant. I try my best to learn the English language. I'm still doing it now. And I think for the younger generation, we must try to excel in our language abilities.
Thank you, Dr. Chien. Dr. Chang.
I just couldn't agree with you more. You know, being a speech language pathologist, all my life, I've been promoting the use of language and the excellence of language as a function of human communication. Also, all over the world, bilingual or trilingualism is a norm. It's normative. If you are a scientist, you would know that there are more people in this world who are bilingual or multilingual. The Asian Pacific Islander communities in the United States are generally multi-generational, multilingual, and multicultural. We must plant a seed in all of our children to understand the multiplicities of our existence. So we want to excel in the language that is used in the United States of America, which is English. We must excel. We must also continue to understand where we came from, how we got over here. And to do that, we have to plant many seeds. And I still think the best seed we can plant is through education, before even kindergarten, all the way K through 12. And we must work with the media and other organizations to work together to build a platform where we can have a large panel and a coalition, but that has to be based on the fundamental respect for human beings. We're all equally human beings. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. Lloyd, this, as the call for action, as to building that coalition and listening to the panelists, where do you see that as your follow-on study in the long-term initiatives that you have in mind? And it sounds like not sounds like everyone is in agreement that strength by numbers and building a coalition are key. Would love to hear your perspective on the long-term initiatives that you're building on.
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of what C100 is focused on doing, we've developed relationships with established groups in other racial communities like the NAACP, National Urban League, the American Jewish Committee, as well as other groups, and of course the Anti-Defamation League. And so we're very much focused on developing really quality programming that can educate these different communities covered by these groups, and to focus on continued engagement with them, on ways we can collaborate going forward. There's a lot that Chinese Americans, since we're still talking about C100, have to learn about the Black community, for instance, and our shared interests. I think there's, as so many panelists have mentioned, right, there's so much education left to be done, not just amongst young people, because I think there are a strong number of young people who are very much now attuned to the shared hopes and struggles of Black Americans and Asian Americans. But then there's a significant group in terms of immigrants who might not necessarily see those kinds of shared similarities. I think that there's a strong opportunity for C100 to at least do that kind of engagement within our own Chinese American immigrant community. And so in terms of immediate next steps, I think there's a lot of potential and responsibility that C100 has in terms of really rallying the Chinese American community, cleaning up house in the sense of it's time to educate our own folks, and at the same time building those really substantive ties with other groups. And we don't want to necessarily just do something for the sake of doing something, right? That's not the whole point of this. This is to really be able to educate people and educate them for them to take action within their own circles and communities, whether that means, oh, look, there's this new research between C100 and the ADL or NAACP, we translate into Chinese and people circulate it on WeChat, right? That's a huge step, right? Because there are these circles that aren't necessarily receiving information in the same ways that we are on this call. Not to knock any groups or anything, but there are all these information silos, and part of growth is breaking those down even a little bit. And so C100 again sees a strong need to build up the Chinese American community on our own front, and then also building those ties with other races, as well as with other ethnic groups within the AAPI block, right? So there's a lot of work to be done. And I think developing quality programming like this with partner organizations at the very local level is the step forward we see.
Excellent. Thank you. Again, thank you to the panelists for your engaging and thoughtful insights into this.